I'm going to talk to you today about timber casualty losses, largely relating to southern pine beetle infestations, SPB, southern pine beetle, as well as IPS beetles. So casualty losses in terms of timber can be defined as timber trees destroyed by a hurricane, fire, earthquake, ice, hail, tornado, and other storms, or casualty losses that may allow the property owners to take a deduction on their federal income tax returns. And this is natural, but really, even things like prescribed fires that get out of control and become wildfires. Somebody is doing a prescribed fire on their own property and it becomes a wildfire on your property. That too should be claimed as a casualty loss, I believe. Now, there may be some legal ramifications there for the adjacent landowner, but nonetheless, that should be a casualty loss as well. And the key in most cases is to figure out the adjusted basis of the timber. That's because the amount of casualty that you can claim is going to be the lesser of the fair market value loss, the fair market value before minus the fair market value after the fair market value loss, or your basis or adjusted basis, or stated differently, the amount of money that you have invested into the timber that you have not yet recovered. Remember, these are capital assets, and so the federal government really is not going to view the capital asset as having any value beyond what you have invested in it until you sell that capital asset and you have, say, a capital gain or a capital loss off the sale of that asset. But nonetheless, right, basically then there's not much beyond the value of the basis that you have in it or the amount that you have invested in it. So most losses are normal and not deductible. So let's say you have a dead pine tree here or there every now and then. Okay, that's not a casualty loss. You can't claim a casualty loss on that. When you establish plantations, industry standard kind of dictates probably anywhere from 80% survival and greater. Well, that's just something to be expected. And right, if you're doing a reforestation and you don't do vegetation control, or the planters planted the seedlings too shallow or something like that, or with longleaf you planted them too deep or something like that, well, that's probably more negligence. That's not necessarily going to qualify as a casualty loss. So just be aware of those things. So quickly here, then we can talk about your basis, or at least the initial basis. For many landowners, the basis is the acquisition cost or the establishment cost. So you purchase timber, that's what you have invested in it initially, at least, or you establish, say, a plantation or like naturally generated a property or so forth. You had some site preparation cost involved. Well, that's the amount of investment that you have in the property, and that's your basis. Now, there is one time with the federal government, will basically acknowledge the fair market value of timber. And that's when somebody passes and then their property is inherited by an individual or a group of individuals. You then get a stepped up basis. So then your basis becomes the fair market value, usually on the date of the person who died, their death. That's one time when the federal government will acknowledge the fair market value of timber. But beyond that, usually it's going to be the amount, essentially it's going to boil down to the amount of basis that you have, the amount that you have invested, and the amount that you have not yet recovered. So basis can increase as you do capital improvements. You pay carrying charges or other costs are capitalized, particularly if you're an investor, because there's limitations as to what you can expense or deduct in the year that the expenses occur, or decrease as allowances for depletion, amortization, or depreciation or deduction are deducted. So, for instance, if you establish a pine plantation or a hardwood plantation and you take the reforestation tax provisions, the deduction and amortization, you use up all the basis, well, you've recovered all of your investment. Therefore, going forward, you really have nothing to recover. You've already recovered it all. Or if you've had thinnings throughout your rotation and you've already recovered all of the basis through those thinnings, you offset the capital gain. You reduce the capital gain by reducing the amount of revenue by your basis. So therefore, you've used it up. Or if you're like a material participant business and you're actively expensing or deducting your costs as you're going throughout the rotation, which you should be doing, you may have very little or no basis at all. So therefore, then remember, it's the lesser of the fair market value loss or the basis or the adjusted basis. And so therefore, then you're probably going to have a minimal amount of basis to recover. But nonetheless, that's your adjusted basis. So quickly then, this is a beautiful, let's just say 30-year-old log pine plantation, been thinned twice. And basically then there's very little basis. There's no basis. It's already been recovered. Think about the fair market value of this plantation. This is probably, think of the saw log. Let's assume there's 100 tons per acre, $20 a ton. That's $2,000. It could be $25 or $3,000. In the eyes of the IRS, the value of this timber is only what you have in your basis, only what you have invested and you have not yet recovered for that standing timber. And that's something that's very hard for people to understand. Because, I'm losing $2,500. I lost, yes, but until you sell that timber, for the most part, unless you inherit it, somebody inherits the fair market value, you get that stepped up basis, that timber really has no value beyond the basis. And if you have no casualty loss, then, it really, my understanding, it really has no value at all because you weren't able to get the basis back. So just think about that going forward. Think about that real quickly when you're talking about playing the markets, and I'm going to wait on the markets and so forth. Think about getting that timber cut because of issues that can arise and your casualty loss. But going forward in these next few slides, let's think about interpretation. Much of taxes are interpretation. So what qualifies as a casualty loss? It's got to be sudden. Got to have a specific date and event. When was the asset lost? Unexpected and unusual. So it can be natural, like I've already told you, like in the first slide, or really even external, like I said, with that prescribed burn. I've even heard where somebody drove a car into somebody's timber and it caught on fire, and therefore that was a casualty loss for the landowner. Right? That's not your fault, per se. So the asset has to be left unfit for use. So it's not necessarily like with timber, it's not necessarily when the tree dies, because the tree immediately right after it dies, right, it still could be used for timber up to some length of time, and it could probably be used for pulpwood for quite some time. So when exactly is the asset, remember these are capital assets, when exactly is the loss of the value incurred? Not necessarily when the tree, something damages the tree or something that kills the tree, it's the loss of the asset itself, the value of the asset. So casualty is the damage, destruction, or loss of property resulting from an identifiable event that is sudden, unexpected, or unusual. And sometimes maybe event is not necessarily the best word, but nonetheless. So an unusual event is one that is not day-to-day occurrence. Unexpected, one that is ordinarily unanticipated and unintended. And here's the kicker, often with casualty losses and whether they qualify or not, an event that is swift, not gradual or progressive. Remember, it's the loss in the asset. That's what some of the people that know more about taxes tell me than myself. It's not necessarily when the tree dies or when the forest gets somehow the trees die in the forest or so forth. It's when the asset becomes unfit for use or you lose the value of the asset. And when exactly is that? How can you determine that? That is very hard to pinpoint exactly related to, say, droughts and pine beetles. So let's talk about the drought. So from July 17, 2023 to October 4th, the maximum daily temperature exceeded 90 degrees for 65 days. Here's the daily temperature. It was above 90 and above even 100, the maximum daily temperature. Then from July 16th, basically to November 10th, at least around Raymond and Crystal Springs, there was literally no rain. High temperatures in those rains, creating probably a 50-year or 100-year drought, things that we have not seen very often in Mississippi. Is it unusual? Yeah, I think it is. Is it unexpected? I think it is, right? I mean, I guess in some ways we expect a drought to happen occasionally, but when exactly do you expect a drought to occur next year? Because of some event that we can predict today? Well, not necessarily. So, to me, those are both unusual and unexpected. Okay, they're not ordinarily unanticipated. It's ordinarily unanticipated, and it's not a day-to-day occurrence. Now, what about sudden? So, when those trees died, could you pinpoint exactly the day that that capital asset lost its value? When exactly did that tree lose its value? Not necessarily even when the tree died per se, but when exactly could you no longer use it for saw logs? When exactly could you no longer use it for chip and saw? When exactly could you no longer use it for pulpwood? Beyond that, that drought is it's not sudden. October 5th is when this tree died. This tree died October 5th, and it's lost its asset on October 8th at 5:30. Right? You can't really, it's pretty difficult to do that. So that, right, and based on precedent, we're not going to get, for pine beetles, Ibsen southern pine beetle, we're not going to get casualty losses. We are not going to get casualty losses for these pine beetle infestations. So for instance, how long does it take blue stain to set in and so forth to decrease the
to minimize the value to saw logs and so forth. So it's not really sudden. Now then, here's the one that we're probably all more concerned about. So southern pine beetle, actually, the temperatures we believe got so hot that the larva got cooked. So therefore then IPS took over, devastating probably 20 million trees, right, by now probably, that we could blame on just pine, let alone the hardwoods. And blue stain came in on the back end of the beetles. Well, the beetles certainly related to the drought. The IPS beetles can only attack low vigor trees. Normally, right, we have 3 to 10 trees in a forest, probably 40-acre tract, may have little pockets here or there, 3 to 10 trees. It's kind of annoying, but the drought was so bad and the heat was so high that basically every tree became low vigor. And we heard of 20, 30, 40-acre tracts being devastated by IPS beetles. Something we've never seen before. Very unusual, unexpected. Now, the federal government, I guess, could argue, well, you haven't been able to thin, so therefore, you know. But still, to me, the amount of the intensity and the amount of mortality is unexpected. We did not expect anything like this going into 2023. Here's the question, is it sudden? Once again, can I pinpoint exactly the date where that IPS beetle came into the tree and exactly the time when that beetle killed the tree? Beyond that, can I say the beetle killed the tree and the drought didn't kill the tree? Can I say the beetle killed the tree and the blue stain didn't kill the tree? How exactly can I determine that? And then, right, it's not necessarily when the tree even died, it's when the value of the tree, the asset, was lost for timber production. And sometimes I forget that too. You got to remember, it's the asset value.
When does it become unusable with saw logs? All right, then. When does it become unusable for chip and saw? Well, what about pulpwood? Pulpwood can probably be even a little bit extended beyond saw log. So it's not probably sudden. So based on precedent, we're not going to get it related to pine beetle infestations. Now, that precedent has really been set by large industrial timber companies, Weyerhaeuser, Rainier, so forth, kind of arguing with the IRS. Here's my point, though, right? Usually this is not NIPF. This is not non-industrial private forest landowners talking with the IRS, you and I. So it could be that if one of us was willing to challenge the IRS, nothing says, I don't believe, nothing says you cannot claim a casualty loss. It's just you're probably going to get audited. You're then going to bring attention to all the other things that you're doing. So you better make sure your whole thing is square, because if you do claim a casualty loss for pine beetles, I most definitely believe you're going to get audited. Who has the resources then to be in a court case with the IRS and so forth? It's pretty difficult then to kind of go about this with the IRS, but it's just going to take a landowner to challenge it. Remember, we have material participant business, investor, and then hobby personal use. Well, hobby personal use has very limited casualty loss potential, no non-casualty loss. They cannot claim non-casualty loss. Only in presidential declared disasters can they claim a casualty loss, and then there's even some greater reductions in the amount that they can claim. So once again, be an investor or a business, material participant business. I don't know why. All you got to have is a management plan, and particularly if you're establishing a plantation or you're spending some money to naturally regenerate your forest, regardless of the species, that to me shows a profit motive. So as far as casualty losses is, an investor is going to have to itemize. Therefore, they're going to lose the standard deduction. So consider that as well. And then the material participant business is going to claim, going to use Form 4797 first, and then Schedule C or F if you're a farmer. So just remember the value of your basis. Remember, you're going to have an appraisal. You're going to have to determine the fair market value before and the fair market value after. So that's going to cost money. If you have $100 if you have $100 in your basis for 200 acres, I wouldn't. What's the cost of the appraisal? I wouldn't claim that. So make sure you kind of think about what your ultimate benefit is. And then non-casualty losses are beneficial because you don't have to have sudden. So it just has to be unexpected and unusual. And these are definitely the pine beetle infestations of 2023 here, and I believe like in Alabama with the southern pine beetle now. Those I think qualify as non-casualty business. There is some argument that investors can claim a non-casualty loss, and once again, it's just going to take a landowner classified or holding their timber as an investor to challenge the IRS. The way that it's worded, an investor could probably get a non-casualty loss too, and it's going to follow the same steps, but a non-casualty loss is going to come off of the depletion unit, and I'll explain a little bit more about this. One of the big differences is casualty losses are deducted from ordinary income, non-casualty are first deducted from capital gains.
Remember, capital gains are taxed at lower rates. Let's just say like 15% rather than 22 or 24% like the ordinary income. So I'd much rather be offsetting or deducting against an ordinary income rather than a capital gain. There's a couple of other things related to casualty and non-casualty losses as well. Here's the big thing, the single identifiable property, and this is kind of like a qualified timber property. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to understand, but nonetheless, business casualty losses shall be determined by reference to the SIP, and I believe this is even the investor as well. So the SIP then is kind of your whole block. It's not just the part of the block or the qualified timber property that was damaged. So whatever your unit that you're keeping track of in your basis, that's going to be your SIP. And in a way, when you claim a casualty loss, you can, in a sense, pool or pull all of the basis into your part of the SIP that was destroyed. Now, if the whole SIP was destroyed, the assets rendered useless, well then, right, you're gonna recover the whole basis, assuming you can get a casualty loss of the whole adjusted basis. But if part of the SIP is destroyed, you then get, in a sense, to kind of borrow from or take advantage or pool or pull the whole basis from the entire SIP. So as the acreage or values of the SIP increases, so does the basis, and that's a good thing. But of course, there's a similar rise in the cost of the appraisal, estimating the fair market value before and after, and therefore you get the loss. So small QTPs or small blocks, easy and cheap to measure the entire property, but right, low basis. So is it even worth it to do the appraisal? Large QTP is going to be expensive and hard to measure the whole property, but you're going to have a high basis. You're going to be able to pull a larger amount of basis, because you have to do the appraisal on the whole area. You can't just do the amount that was damaged. And that can sometimes be a problem. Remember, what is the value in your basis? Is it even worth it to you? So I've already alluded to this. The amount that you can claim is the lesser of the fair market value lost based on the appraisal, fair market value before minus fair market value after for the SIP, or the basis in the SIP. So once again, if you've recovered all your basis, well then don't even mess with the appraisal, because you're not going to get it. You can't even claim a casualty loss, let alone when you get into the argument of the sudden. So think about all these things kind of as you're going forward. So here's just an example of the SIP. So let's assume this is 100 acres. This is your single identifiable property. This is the block, or this is your qualified timber property. Let's say 25 acres was damaged. Well, when I'm doing a casualty loss, I got to do an appraisal of the whole area, right? And in that whole area, I'm also determining the appraisal in the damaged area. So the fair market value before the SIP and the fair market value after the SIP, and that's the loss. Well, I get to kind of, for this part here, I get to pool the basis from the whole area. Therefore, then I'm going to probably recover a larger amount of, my casualty loss is going to be greater than if I just did this portion of the stand, because I can pool the basis all the way from the whole stand. The non-casualty loss, I just get to use the percent of the basis that's within this damaged area. So the casualty loss is beneficial because I can, in a sense, usually it's going to be beneficial I'd say 95% of the time, because I can kind of pool or pull from the basis from the entire SIP. So I'm going to finish on this. So here's an advantage. Let's say a fire caused $5,000 in damage to timber and a qualified timber property. The appraisal, which I think you can deduct the cost of the appraisal as well, $19,000 before the fire for market value, and then $14,000 after. Well, you had a $5,000 for market value loss. But remember, the value that you can claim, the amount of casualty loss that you can claim, is the lesser of the loss in fair market value in the basis. So the basis in the whole SIP, in the whole block, not just in the part that was damaged, is $2,000. So then the loss that you can claim is the lesser, or $2,000. Thank you.